The fact is that for nearly 30 years after the Revolution, the sounder and better part of the Church maintained an unequal conflict against the perpetual encroachments of the state. They struggled against the arbitrary interference of government with the freedom of the General Assembly in summoning, proroguing, and dissolving its meetings at pleasure. They struggled against the admission of the curates into the fellowship of the Church, a measure so pregnant with corruption that no considerations of expediency could justify their submission to it. They struggled against the incorporating union with England, by which Scotland virtually pledged her concurrence in the perpetual establishment of prelacy in England and Ireland. They struggled against the imposition of ensnaring oaths from which the Church has never since been emancipated. They struggled against the restoration of patronage by the act of Queen Anne, many of them being strongly impressed with the boundless injury it would inflict on the cause of true religion. But they still clung to an unsuitable and improper state alliance, and were overcome. And under the operation of these measures, the sounder part became progressively less capable of contending with their opponents. The house of David waxed weaker and weaker, and the house of Saul stronger and stronger. And then came the reign of moderatism, a long and dark and dreary period, a century of ecclesiastical misrule and oppression. Then came a race of ministers cringing and servile to the aristocracy, but truculent and haughty to the people. Shepherds who ate the fat and clothed themselves with the wool, but they fed not the flock. Then the wise maxims of heathen moralists were much more quoted in pulpit orations and much more admired than the heavenly maxims of the Savior or the writings of the inspired apostles. Then the rights of the Christian people were violently usurped, and the voice of remonstrance stifled, while a high-handed patronage filled the vacant pulpits with the protégés and parasites of the nobility and gentry. Then the confession of faith, although still subscribed by ministers at their ordination, all honorable men, was commonly regarded as a piece of antiquated lumber, full of fanaticism and absurdity. Then came in a flood of Arminianism, and Pelagianism, and rationalism, and Socinianism, unblushingly propounded in the universities and in vast numbers of pulpits. And what might have become of genuine piety and practical godliness under all this, it is impossible to conjecture, had not the exalted Messiah, in his zeal for his own cause, constrained a few right-hearted ministers and a multitude of pious people to come out and be separate, and to adopt measures for preserving and extending the knowledge and power of the gospel beyond the pale of the establishment. One of the ablest advocates for reform in the Church of Scotland at the present day, who justly designates the system of moderatism as an anti-Christian system, presents in a recent pamphlet this affecting picture of the period of church history to which we have just referred. Quote, "For about 20 years after the Revolution, the Church of Scotland was, upon the whole, in a most efficient condition, and conferred most important benefits upon the country. But about the time of the restoration of patronage, the elements of spiritual corruption and decay began to work and to show themselves. The old faithful ministers who had endured the persecution had gone to their rest. The corrupting influence of the Episcopalian conformists who had been received into the Church was extending itself, men of ability and activity, but of unsound principles, and destitute apparently of personal religion, contrived by sycophancy and court favor to get into situations of importance, were made principals of universities and professors of divinity, and this, combined with the exercise of patronage, restored by a popish and Jacobitical faction, and exercised generally by an irreligious and profligate aristocracy, spread the leaven of iniquity, and thus paved the way for the ascendancy of the moderate party. Under their reign, during the latter half of last century, the preaching of sound doctrine and the practice of serious religion were discountenanced by the whole weight of ecclesiastical authority. Everything that a Christian church ought to aim at was disregarded. The rights and consciences of Christian men were trampled underfoot, and ministers were settled even at the point of bayonet. Our ecclesiastical leaders had for their most intimate friends avowed infidels, and governed the church in a worldly and infidel spirit. Though professing to act like philosophers and gentlemen, they were notoriously engaged in a pitiful scramble for pelf and pensions. The greatest offense a minister could commit was to be valiant for the truth. The church courts did their utmost to protect those accused of heresy and crime, and manifested as much indifference about the interests of morality which they pretended to respect, as about the doctrines of the gospel which they avowedly despised. unquote. Such is the testimony of Mr. Cunningham, and although the language of Dr. Chalmers on the same subject may contain less of the indignant reprehension which characterizes the passage just quoted, it fully corroborates the sentiment of the passage. Quote, "If the effect of the present contest," says the doctor, "be to re-establish the triumph of moderatism, the likelihood is that it will recall both the inoperative theology and the careless ministration which obtained in the days of our fathers, and alienated thousands and tens of thousands from the church." Or, in other words, a theology which tells not on the hearts and consciences of men, a ministration which lost to the establishment that mighty and pervading influence for good, which, under the reign of apostolic doctrine in the congregation, and of apostolic diligence from house to house among the families, it at one time had throughout the great bulk and body of the population, unquote. And when contrasting the moderate and the evangelical, he describes the former as, quote, "nauseating and despising, as ignoble and fanatical and vulgar," what the other holds in highest esteem, as being at once the theology of conscience and the theology of the New Testament, unquote. Insofar, therefore, as moderatism has prevailed, the Church of Scotland has been an engine for evil and not for good, a pillar for error and delusion rather than a pillar and ground of the truth, a fraud and deception upon the souls of men. What infinite evil has arisen from the maintenance of such a system as a national institution, while 3 entire generations passed into eternity? What fearful iniquity to impose upon the people whose eternal welfare was at stake, a ministry that nauseated and despised the gospel as ignoble and fanatical and vulgar, a ministry publicly hired and supported to feed the people with the bread of life, but who starved or poisoned the souls committed to their charge, a ministry of whom a weeping remnant in the land might have taken up the language of Mary, quote, "They have taken away my Lord, and I know not where they have laid him," unquote. And to what do we ascribe all this? To the fact that the Church was united to the state? By no means, but to her union with an irreligious and ungodly state. In the lapse of years the population was doubled or tripled, but the destitute condition of this increasing multitude seemed to give no concern to the Church. She not only made no effort to provide instruction for them herself, but discouraged and obstructed those who would have made provision. Other churches sprung up and labored and grew strong from very small beginnings. But the national church, publicly supported and possessing 20 or 50 times the resources of all her competitors, continued of the same dimensions, stunted and without growth. Even the pious people who were in her communion appeared almost as indifferent to the moral destitution around them as their irreligious companions. The wise virgins slept as profoundly as the foolish. Say not, it was the misfortune of the times that churches were not orthodox, for those churches around her, which kept free from the corrupting alliance into which she had entered, continued to be orthodox when she was most heretical. And whatever may have been the causes of decay in churches in other lands, it is clear to demonstration that the inefficiency and heresy and stunted growth of the Church of Scotland for 100 years were the result and consequence of that unhappy and fatal alliance which opened the way for the unhallowed and wicked interference of an irreligious and Erastian civil government. But the reign of moderatism has, for the present at least, been subverted, and a most material change for the better has now taken place in the character and operations of the national church. In this we greatly rejoice, but while we frankly admit that an extensive and very beneficial charge has taken place in her, and that the return of orthodoxy and activity and a growing spirit of independence has given her a place in the esteem and affection of many in the land, to which she had long been a stranger, still we are constrained to hold that there is nothing in all this to prove the lawfulness or advantage of an alliance with an irreligious government. Nay, if additional evidence to the contrary had been required after the experience of 300 years, this recent revival in the Church of Scotland would have supplied it. Has her alliance with the state prompted or facilitated or promoted any one of the improvements that has heretofore been effected? On the contrary, has not her relation to the state been the great drag and impediment to her progress in reformation ever since she set herself to attempt improvement? Those changes which she calls reformation, the noble and the honorable, whom she has been accustomed to lean upon as her steadfast friends, have pronounced to be grievous blunders and defections. Her present attitude, which she accounts one of reformation, appears to them as one of turbulence and sedition, which she ventures to assert her claim, when she ventures to assert her claim of spiritual independence and to exercise those rights which inherently and inalienably belong to every Church of Christ. She is charged with putting forth monstrous and extravagant pretensions. As long as she was plain and obsequious, although for all the great purposes of an establishment inefficient and worthless, she was cherished and caressed by the great. But now, when she begins to assert her proper rights, and to make vigorous efforts to cast off the yoke she had long borne so tamely, her former friends stigmatize and scourge her with little mercy. They offer to adjust the yoke that galls her somewhat more commodiously, but at the same time, more tightly than before, when she declines the proffered kindness, they fly off in a rage, and leave her to extricate herself as best she can. And here, verily, is the alternative which mere politicians have extended to the Church in all ages, and which the history of the Scottish concede to the state a real and effectual control over her. If the mutual compact be so arranged as to secure to civil rulers as large a return of political influence as they could reasonably expect to secure by the same amount of wealth expended in any other way, then their good offices and friendship will be granted to her without parsimony and without grudging. But if, on the contrary, the Church be faithful to her divine Lord, and disdain every compromise with those who would usurp his authority, if she resolutely maintain her own rights and sturdily resist every Erastian encroachment, if she be faithful in exposing what is corrupt, even in the civil constitution, and in testifying against what may be unrighteous or impious in the administration, it will invariably be found that in the prosecution of such a course the favor of ungodly rulers will be forfeited, and she must either make a compromise or be deprived of their support. Quote, "What fellowship hath righteousness with unrighteousness, and what concord hath Christ with Belial?" Unquote.